Stephen, one thing I'd like to know is how do you find out about the visual arts activity that's happening around this town? Are people good at telling you what's on?
Well, I think they're better when they talk face to face, of course. That's always the way to go, and that's why I understand the difficulty about getting our message across to people on the East Coast. But invariably it is through email and other electronic forms of communication, Facebook and so on. I receive an immense amount of press releases, and that raises an interesting point in its own because of, obviously the people's capacities to generate those press releases in the first place, and that's why institutions like this one and others have a greater capacity to get their message out as well. So there's a head start there from the outset, and that's why I was taken by the idea that Lisa talked about undiscovering the canon, because a canon applies in every culture, community, orthodoxies, if you like, and receive wisdom about what's worth something and what's not. So it's difficult sometimes to cut through that and to seek out the new, because that's the essence of news after all, as it is art really. So it's you're kind of sifting through a lot of chaff to get to the core,
And for you, you've got to, in your case, because you work for a daily newspaper, they want news stories, don't they? Your arts stories very often have to have a news peg, whether or not it's an event happening tomorrow or, the decision to cancel Carmen because of funding. Is that right? That in a sense you've got to have an angle?
Yeah, well, I missed the biggest story of the year. I was away on leave, so I missed the whole Carmen palaver. I was kind of grateful for that, to be honest. There's a number of different imperatives within a daily newspaper. It also runs regular features and meeting those different deadlines, which are often ramming up against each other. It's a matter of juggling those internal conflicts. But that's not me this time, I hope. That was an embarrassing start earlier.
But Stephen, you don't get people saying, oh, I don't want to cover that because it's Western Australian. In fact, in your case, the very fact that an art event is in Western Australia is by definition relevant to you. So you're in a kind of unique position.
Well, it's been interesting in recent years, and particularly most of the time that I've been covering the arts, which is now 7 or 8 years. I've found that the more provincial the better from my perspective, because that, for us, as the West Australian, is the gap in the market. I mean, there are a multitude of voices out there covering the national scene, and I accept that there are so many sources of information and news that I've made the decision invariably 99% of the time to focus on the local scene. It's the tradition of the West anyway, as the journal of record. So from that position, that's the case.
And Nicola, do you find it hard to go to your bosses and say, look, there's this fantastic event going on in WA, there are these fabulous artists, I really think we need to cover them? How do you convince them? Do you?
We set some editorial priorities quite early on when we relaunched the website, with a commitment to doing the festival circuit, essentially. So there was always going to be coverage from each of the main metro centres throughout the year. And then the assumption is when you've got a production team on the ground in Perth, they also spend their time during that week finding other stories. And it's an imperfect model, I admit that, because we often miss a lot of stuff because of the festival hype, but it at least gives us some focus, and it, I suppose, normalises the idea internally that there will always be coverage coming in from all over the country. That's for Arts Online and TV. It's a different story with my news colleagues. The mix is a co-production between News 24 and Arts Online, and we have a different set of priorities. So often I'm pitching feature videos that are probably a little bit more in depth than what they would do, and they just want the sharp, snappy, fun, poppy stories that are going to generate a little bit of buzz leading up to broadcast and then subsequent for online. So it is tougher getting a story about an artist or an art event from Perth up into the national news cycle. I won't. Yeah,
and things may change because, of course, the ABC is staring down the barrel of some major funding cuts. My colleague Doug Spencer, who has got a long history of arts coverage in WA and is continuing to contribute, one knows for how long. I mean, are you concerned about that? Are we in WA likely to suffer from what seems to be coming with funding cuts?
I think that question is slightly above my pay grade. There are conversations happening. No, but I won't dismiss it. There are conversations happening within senior management as to how we make those enormous budget cuts. And it is infrastructure, and it is staff, and it is programming. That's the reality we face. But, you know, we have a really good managing director who cares very deeply about the ABC's commitment to national coverage, and not national out of Sydney, national as in local national. In regards to the arts, we are, like every other unit within the ABC, tightening our belts, but there is commitment from the board. We have a very strong advocate for the arts in Simon Mordaunt, and commitment from the managing director to remain committed to the arts, and our director of television, Richard Finlayson, has made it a priority.
Well, you also have Fiona Stanley on the board, and she's extremely supportive of the arts. Yeah. And she's supportive because she has seen the impact of cultural and arts activity, including visual arts, on communities, regional communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. She knows that it's to do with health and well-being and every other thing. Ted and I work for The Australian, as you know. Ted is a critic. I find it hard sometimes, Ted, as you know, because we've talked about this, when I ring up Sydney and say, look, there's this fantastic thing happening. And I get sometimes in Sydney the view, oh, well, yes, but who are they again? What is it again? Where is Coonawarrigi? Yes, this is...
Oh, yeah, all the time. The idea that you pitch something and they go, so what's the national interest here? You say, well, I wonder how often you say that to people who are pitching ideas from Sydney or Melbourne. You know, it's an implicit notion that, of course, it's of national interest if it's coming from those states. So, yeah, I find it really annoying too, because it is important to have, it's fantastic, and Steve in the West is great, because you always can be assured of really good coverage of activities that happen here. But the national thing is really important. If artists are going to build their careers, it has to be at a national level as well. And that's the thing which is really frustrating, because if you pitch an idea about a young artist working in Western Australia or Moana or Paper Mountain or something, they're just not interested.
And I think I have to admit, I find the same thing. For example, the Guy Gray Smith exhibition, which you reviewed.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't?
But Melissa wrote for it. Melissa Hartley.
But I would say that, you know, many of my colleagues in Sydney would never have heard of Guy Gray Smith. They may not have even heard of Howard Taylor. So you're up against that kind of ignorance of the backstory. Having said that, and I mentioned Coonawarrigi just now, I was sent to Coonawarrigi twice. Now, this is, for those of you who don't know, it is a very remote spot on the Canning Stock route. I mean, being sent to Coonawarrigi twice is a bit like being sent to the moon once. It's fantastic. And why was I sent there? Because Qantas magazine were fascinated by what was happening there with some of the women artists, some of whom you saw, in fact. Lisa Slade would know some of those artists who work up and down the stock route. And the other time I was sent was when Form, a WA-based organisation, was doing their superb and historic work on the Canning Stock route, which resulted in a national exhibition that was bought by the National Gallery of Australia. So, in a way, I think I'm so confirming what we heard earlier today, which is that if I pitch a story that is to do with Indigenous artists, my chances of getting it in are higher. And I love doing them. But I also feel that I don't approach the stories necessarily as being an Indigenous story, and I'll just give you a very quick example. The Square Kilometre Array Project, which is the world's largest radio astronomy project, of which Australia has half, South Africa has the other. These scientists got behind the notion of bringing arts and science together. And if you go to the Lawrence Wilson Gallery right now, there is John Curtin. Not Lawrence Wilson. John Curtin.
There's a great exhibition.
There's a good one at Lawrence Wilson. John Curtin Gallery. There is a superb and really moving exhibition, I think, of the work of Murchison artists and the work of people from the Kalahari, the San Bushmen, as they're called. Two peoples who are affected directly by the Square Kilometre Array. The footprint of this radio telescope will be there and there. This is not an Indigenous exhibition as far as I'm concerned. It's the most remarkable exhibition because it's all about the social history of Western Australia. It's about the science progress in Western Australia. It's about the creativity of Western Australia. It's about the historic decision of the state government to back that project to the hilt, Colin Barnett. It is all about all those things, and that's why I wanted to cover it and managed to get it in the review pages of The Australian. So I'm not as interested in labels anymore, and I don't know about you. I am interested, though, in getting stuff from this part of the third of the continent in the national media.
Well, exactly, and that's why I don't, when I write and say to the editor at The Australian and say, I want to write an article about a really mediocre artist just because they're West Australian. I mean, that would be insane. What I say is, there is a fantastic exhibition here. There's a great artist who really deserves to be able to have national coverage. The problem is, so it's not about whether we want to promote artists who are not, excellent in every respect. That's not the issue. It's not about artists who are looking at an international issues or whatever. It's simply the fact that often, if they're working out of this place, they're going to be overlooked.
Okay, so we haven't talked about the new media, and Nicola and Steve, I want you to talk about that. I know, for one, that Humphrey Bauer is doing some wonderful reviewing of both theatre and of some of the arts. From Pika, the recent exhibition of Pika, he wrote about in Crikey, which is online. I have to say, and Humphrey wouldn't mind me saying it, he's not paid to do that work, but he does really good work. So, is there a role, and should we stop bleating and look to the new media, the social media, the websites, the online blogs, etc., to get our message out?
Yes. I mean, I will touch on the Crikey example. There has been a bit of brouhaha around Crikey not paying their writers. And when the Daily Review, which is their arts website, was launched, it bubbled to the surface again, and they lost a number of their good writers because of it. Ben Altham went to Arts Hub, and I think that's a shame because now his essential writing is behind a paywall a lot of the time. Paywalls are a different thing. From our point of view, blogs, online media is our bread and butter. I mean, my team and the freelancers and stringers I work with, we certainly file for a weekly deadline for a TV outcome, but day to day I'm working with writers and reviewers filing for online first and foremost.
Are they paid, by the way?
They are.
Right. Because I used to work for ABC here in Perth, and then the money ran out.
I came in to the ABC from a magazine background, and when I was a freelance writer, I was being paid by the word, which was great, and it's not the situation for a lot of publications now. So I was adamant that I wanted to pay a decent writing fee, but I also expected decent writing. And we work with some really, really great reviewers, Alison Croggan for theatre, Claudia Lawson for dance. I even convinced Ian to write a piece for me at some point. And I know Eve's in the audience somewhere, Eve Sullivan, who I've worked with in the past over there. So yes, I will pay my writers. I don't think that the Crikey model reflects the time and effort that very, very good art criticism requires.
But so, Stephen, if you're addressing this audience, an audience that has the stories, knows the people, knows some of the history of the artists and the work that's created, what's your advice to them in getting their profile up and their message out?
Through online, you mean?
Online or
I mean,
the other way, but start with
in
online.
some ways, I'm the dinosaur who's being overtaken by the fleet-footed mammals. The newspaper itself is suffering the same issues as many of the commercial galleries. That model is in decline as far as the paper is concerned, and we've lost a lot of staff. And you could look at the Fairfax example on the East Coast. That all affects the capacity for people to write stories of great depth and breadth, because time is even more pressing. It does open up opportunities for more contributors, and I don't know where I'd be without my contributors, who I consider to be knowledgeable about the field in a way that I'm not.
You pay them well?
Well, that's not my call. That's above my pay scale, so it's definitely out of my hands. And yeah, we're all subject to the final word of the bean counters on that as much as other things. So, look, the power of social media. I mean, it's interesting because, as one of the members of the audience pointed out earlier, there's a preponderance of sort of mid-career people on the panels today, and we heard a snippet of a different perspective on the art scene just before the tea break. There's a hunger, clearly. There's a fleet-footed nature. The DIY culture, is facilitated much more so by the internet, and a lot of younger artists are taking advantage of that, I think, to speak directly to their audience, whatever that may be. And it's interesting when that takes physical form, as it does, or as it will in a few weeks' time at the bakery, when the Raw Art event is on, and that's an event. And as a lot of arts organisations in other areas, like the Symphony Orchestra, for example, are finding that when they're programming festivals or events, they generate a buzz and an excitement, and people all want to be there. And it's interesting how that Raw Art, which is an international organisation of artists across all art forms, and they have a one-night pop-up affair, and people buy a ticket to get in, and there's drinks and entertainment and the whole rest of it. And that'll no doubt be chock-a-block and exciting.
We're
it's all about
that. In WA, aren't we? We like to get together. I would like people, if there's somebody in the audience who'd like to comment on some of the points Ted made, because we need to look forward. Do people have some ideas about what was suggested by Ted in the way of getting the message out better? Go ahead.
I just had a brainwave.
Could we just get the mic very, very quickly? Could you just pass it through very quickly? Thank you. Somebody's just had a brainwave. Yes, go ahead.
I just had a brainwave. I wonder whether we could do the equivalent of Wikipedia here in Western Australia, where we just have a site and we just all contribute and put stuff on. Would that work? So everybody that knows of some sort of thing that's happening, because, when you look at the West Australian or whatever and you look what's going on for the week, really it's so sketchy.
You could have a discovered on the Undiscovered Symposium website or something. Yeah, that sounds good.
But we'll have it so that everybody contributes and say, all right then,
Okay, there's one idea. Can I get the mic goes down there? Was it Yvonne? No. Okay. Is there somebody else? Yes, just there. Up the top.
All right, thank you. As a senior member of this art community, I guess what concerned me in my career, as most of the panel know, goes back to about the early 70s. But what concerns me from hearing Ted and other comments, that the situation is still the same with the East Coast. And whether you like it or not, that's been a pattern all the way through. In fact, I thought Stuart Elliott might have mentioned and I talked with him today about it, the first triennial, sculpture triennial in 1982, as we'd driven across, about 20 of us, across the Nullarbor to get to the triennial in Melbourne. We brushed aside in order to deal with someone more important coming in from Sydney as we went to register. Now, that's been a pattern that's gone on and on and on. Now, I'm talking about a good 25, 30 years, more than 30 years, in fact, it's been the same attitude. We really haven't bit into the Australian scene. I guess we've reached the point where something needs to be done. And to give you some idea, in fact, I drew this, get my glasses focused here. This is John MacDonald's review, because as you know, or a lot of people here will know, I was one of 9 Australian artists selected for the French exchange, following another exchange where 9 artists from France were selected by Australian curators to
Could you just make your comment a bit briefer? So I'll try
and be brief, but yep. I did actually prepare this thinking I might be able to make that contribution. But John MacDonald's review, there was a chilly atmosphere in Chapelle Salpêtrière last week for the opening of the exhibition works of 9 Australian artists. The exhibition was the culmination of the second leg of the French-Australian Artist Exchange program, which kicked off in '86 with visits by 9 well-known French artists to colleges and galleries around Australia. Last year, 9 Australians, Julie Brown-Rapp, Les Doré, Bill Henson, David Jones, John Nixon, Bronwyn Oliver, Robert Owen, Mike Parr, Robert Randall were accommodated as artists in residence by the colleges and contemporary art spaces of different French cities. 3 of the most impressive displays were those of David Jones from Perth, Les Doré from Lismore and Sydney-based, and so on. It says perhaps the outstanding success of the program was David Jones, who found himself on the tiny island of Vassouvière in the centre of contemporary art.
David,
now, I will make the point here. It says here, Jones is based in Western Australia and his work is not well known in the eastern states, and in Australia to not be known in Sydney or Melbourne almost means not being known at all. It was one of the virtues of this exchange that artists such as Jones and Doré were able to represent some of the regional diversity of Australian art, a role usually gobbled up by the same old rogues gallery of international style professionals.
So is John MacDonald somebody who has raised the profile of WA art? I mean, he's a national writer.
That is a positive comment.
Yeah. Has he over time?
He has come to Western Australia and written about, but he tends to focus on things that are happening on the eastern seaboard because that's where he's based.
Right, right. Yes, quick question there. There was a person there.
I'd like to talk about a Western Australian problem that I think you're going to have to fix up. Joanna Mendelson and I are involved in a large national project, and we've come here because we've had so much trouble researching Western Australian art. And one aspect of what Ted was talking about boils down to the fact that you people don't have a librarian in the Art Gallery of Western Australian's library. So Ted talked about the lack of research here, but it has a two-way effect. I go to my librarian in the Art Gallery of South Australia's library, and I'll say, "Now, what have you got on Western Australian art?" And she says, "There's a silence around that. We have almost nothing because there isn't a librarian here. That librarian isn't then networking with the other librarians in all the other art gallery libraries and sending to them the publications from Western Australia." So a small salary would actually address a lot of what Ted is talking about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Your question's brief, that would be great. Thank you.
The artist who's been the West Australian artist who's been most mentioned today has been Brian Blanchflower, who is the most reticent of all artists, who lives quietly in Bedfordale, and yet he's known nationally and probably internationally. And
okay.
Why
is that?
Well, Brian has shown in Sydney and Melbourne. He has been picked up by different curators. That is one of the things. I mean, when curators do come, they do identify really good artists here. Years ago, when Bridget Riley and people came through, they identified Howard Taylor. You know, a number of reviewers have come through, of critics and curators have come through and identified Brian Blanchflower and included him in exhibitions. And we've all locally, John Curtin Gallery had an exhibition of Brian's work, Lawrence Wilson has, the Art Gallery of WA has. So locally, he is one artist who has been given a lot of attention. There are publications on his work, and when people visit, like Lisa, they are invited to meet Brian. So in a sense, somebody was talking about where's this infrastructure, where's the network that provides the support to artists. Well, in that particular case, Brian has had a lot. Brian has had a lot of support like that.
So is the answer then, Ted, do you think, to go to someone like Duncan and say, could your department provide funds to bring in curators, to bring in heads of departments at the ABC? In other words, to bring in influential people in the cultural sector to come and see what is going on in this town? Because Lisa went to 20 studios, I think, over the last 3 days, and no doubt we may or may not see the result of that in the next Adelaide biennial. Is Duncan, is it worth pitching to you?
Screen industry very differently, and when you look at Screen West and its engagement with screen industry around the world, way of trying to get the screen sector in this state to participate and be recognised internationally is engaging major international people and so on, and it's working pretty well because it's a structured screen industry support mechanism that government understands, so on. We haven't taken that approach in. Well, I think that's the issue, is should we be taking a two-pronged attack, one looking at at visual art and I guess craft as well, sector development as a kind of an industry. What are these things that drive the market and responses that might improve recognition and market responses? And secondly, the things that we do now, which is largely art form development and focusing on the creativity elements of it. So I think we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time, is essentially the takeaway I'm getting from this. And we're not structured in that way at the moment to do it, but it seems like a valid thing to rethink the model because we do it in other art forms. We just haven't structured to do it in this one.
And I think it's something that we could do. And if we just say, okay, well, that's something that the DCA have to do, then it probably is going to take a long time. But it's something that all the universities, all the organisations, the arts agencies, we should all be collaborating together to say, look, here's a really good person. I mean, Jenny was saying that about tourism. We should be bringing in the editors of the major arts newspapers and the arts journals and giving them an opportunity to see what's here in the same way that Lisa's had an opportunity to see what's been happening here.
Yeah.
Can I just say something on that point, though? I think it's also essential that local film industry and the visual arts work together here in Perth rather than flying people in, because if we go back to the Art in Australia example, that series came about from a conversation between Margie Bryant, the producer, and Edmund at a gallery event. They brought the idea to the ABC. It is absolutely essential that filmmakers in Perth are working with the visual artists here to tell really rich, engaging stories from a local perspective, rather than someone parachuting in from ABC in Sydney with a film crew.
Yeah. Well, many of the visual artists, some of the visual artists of the next generation are in fact film artists as well. I mean, you've got two in one. You have people like Pilar Martin-Dupont.
Exactly. I mean, that is the backbone of the Screen West initiative that we did. That we were trying to sow a bed, essentially. Yeah.
Right. Okay. A quick couple more questions and then.
Okay. The comment about the librarian in the art gallery, I understand it was moved across to the state library, that function. That's what I was told had happened. The other thing you need to be mindful of is that there are things happening like the National Library of Australia through the state library have been archiving artists' websites in Perth, although they've stopped doing it for the last few years. I'm not sure whether it's just my circumstance or not. So there are actually depositories of information that you can actually go through, and you can look at previous editions' websites, because some artists don't maintain pages, they drop them off and put new ones on. So there are actually online depositories of information out there.
Thank you. We're going to get chucked out of here very shortly if we don't leave.
Can I just add one
We're
thing?
actually having drinks after this, and it would be, and I noticed Diane Mossinson with your name, with your hand up, and it would be wonderful to hear.
Joanna Mendelssohn's got the...
This is actually important.
Yes.
It's boring.
I might just let Joanna have a quick word, and if you can get the mic to Diana.
This is relevant. Ted should know it because last time he did a complaint on the Conversation website, I responded by pointing out that I'm the editor-in-chief of the Design and Art Australia Online, DAAO.org.au, and it's an open access, moderated database of all artists who are able to get on it by people like Kathy Speck, and I moderate it. So if you want to have West Australian artists recorded, if you want to have your exhibitions recorded, the resource has been around for a number of years. We've had a number of ARC grants. We're on another one at the moment, which will be also in part creating a community of scholars, not obvious to the average reader, but anybody can post basic information on the DAO. Now the other thing is, people were talking, or someone down there was talking about get somebody to do a website where you can all do open access. WordPress is free. The Art Life was started by Andrew Frost with no funds whatsoever. The Art Life is a Sydney-based blog, and it turned into a television series. I mean, that's how it happens. You do it yourself.
And what about crowdfunding for publications, for example? Now, could I get Diane Mossinson to make a comment?
Well, I was only just going to add something that the Curtin School of Film and Television actually have done a couple of programs. It's part of their annual program, and they go out and do artist interviews twice a year, and the result of that filming television program, it's journalists involved as well as the film students, and they run it on NITV. It's called Nyunga Danju, and it's been a really good program. And they